It's now my pleasure to welcome Bart Harvey. And about 20-something years ago, a much younger Bart Harvey came into my office. I had just been elected to the House of Representatives with Jim Rouse and began to talk to me about the importance of affordable housing. And it's been a 20-plus year mentorship, and I'm very appreciative of Bart for all that over these many years. Bart became the CEO of Enterprise Community Partners, and for many of you, you know he's remained a force to be reckoned with in housing. He's on the board of Fannie Mae, and he is here to introduce our keynote speaker. I'll also note that Bart is on the Terwilliger Foundation Advisory Board and is a great contributor in that space too. Bart Harvey. Where are you, Bart? Stage right.
Rick, thank you very much. And let me just say what a great honor and privilege it is for me to introduce to you our secretary, Dr. Ben Carson, our 17th secretary of the Department of Housing and Urban Development. For 30 years, Secretary Carson served as Director of Pediatric Neurosurgery at the Johns Hopkins Children's Center in Baltimore, a position he assumed when he was just 33 years old, becoming the youngest major division director in Johns Hopkins history. He has done all kinds of things through his lifetime. He's received dozens of honors and awards in recognition of his many achievements, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor, and the NAACP's highest honor that it presents. He's authored 9 books. I've read Gifted Hands and a number of the other ones. They were bestsellers, and he co-wrote some with his wife, Candy. The U.S. News Media Group and the Harvard Center for Public Leadership named him among, quote, America's best leaders in 2008. Dr. Carson and his wife co-founded the Carson Scholars Fund, which recognizes young people of all backgrounds for exceptional academic and humanitarian accomplishments. Now, a personal aside, as a lifelong Democrat and a native of Baltimore, 15 years ago in Baltimore, I met Dr. Carson when he was still the head of pediatric neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins, and on his own time, as if that wasn't busy enough for him, and with his own money, he was going out into inner city public schools to try and recognize not only athletic achievement, there are awards for that, but setting up an award for academic achievement and civic participation. And then shortly after that, a friend of mine, a close friend's daughter, 9-year-old, was diagnosed with brain cancer. And I said, where are you going? They said, Johns Hopkins. Who's going to be your surgeon? They said, somebody named Ben Carson. I said, she'll be fine. And she was. And 2 years ago, I saw her married, healthy as could be. This man cares. It's not just about medicine. He cares about people. He cares about his community. And if we go back to what he was first working on, I agreed to help him a little bit to get started. But the fund he created is operating in 50 states in the District of Columbia and has recognized more than 7,300 scholars, awarded more than $7.3 million in scholarships, and installed more than 150 Ben Carson reading rooms around the country. That's this man. He was born in Detroit to a single mother with a 3rd-grade education who worked multiple jobs to support their family. and Secretary Carson was raised to love reading and education. He graduated from Yale University. I went to Harvard, I don't hold that against him, and earned his MD from the University of Michigan Medical School. He and his wife are the proud parents of 3 adult sons and 3 grandchildren. And let me just say, I salute him for all that he has done and what he really wants to do. And I offered him my help in any way that I can to forward HUD's vision and his vision, not only for what HUD can do, but his vision for what can happen to low-income people, particularly those of color in this country, and where we need to go as a country on that issue. So he cares deeply. He's finally getting reinforcements. For 5 months, he had no one who came through the approval process. And Pam Patnaud, as you just heard, was approved for deputy secretary. She was the executive director of the Terwilliger Institute. She understands these issues. Brian Montgomery has been nominated to run FHA. He needs some more reinforcements to go through the process, but he is an extraordinary man who cares a great deal and gets it, and I hope all of you will be working with him to make HUD all it can be. Please, our 17th Secretary.
Well, thank you, Bart, for that extremely warm introduction. You know, Bart Harvey is a man I've known for many years, and living in Baltimore for a very long period of time, had a tremendous influence, particularly in elevating people. And really, that's what it's all about. I'd like to thank everyone at the Terwilliger Foundation, especially its namesake, Ron Terwilliger, and all the organizers of this great event for inviting me to speak here today. And we're also joined by one of my predecessors at HUD, the Honorable Henry Cisneros, who did a wonderful job at HUD. And former New York Congressman Rick Lazio, who has helped me tremendously throughout this whole process. And you know, there have been so many people who've been very wonderful, very talented, and are dedicated to elevating people in our society. Now, I'd like to start off by saying I am a law-abiding citizen, and you know, my faith tells me that it's wrong to steal. But I tell you, stealing Pam Patnaud, that was the best thing I ever did. And I have to apologize for that, but I'd do it again in a second. You know, she has amazing skills, very dedicated, extremely knowledgeable about the state of affordable housing in America, and also a HUD veteran who knows the system there, knows many people there, has provided great leadership and some great ideals for improvement. So as Bart Harvey said in the introduction, the first 5 months I was there by myself with no assistant secretaries or deputy secretary, which most people would say was a horrible, horrible disadvantage. But you know, there's always something good in a bad situation. And that is, I had to learn all those things that I wouldn't have learned before. So now when we finally do get people and they come to me with stuff, I'll know what they're talking about. So, you know, that worked out very well. But we're really grateful to have Pam come back. And, you know, we gather here today with Thanksgiving and Christmas and Hanukkah just around the corner, and the New Year, with all of those possibilities, is well within our view. 2017 seemed to fly by, and if you'll indulge me, I just want to talk a little bit about where we are now and where we are headed. As many of you know, there are somewhere between 8.5 and 11 million households in America that are severely burdened. They pay more than 50% of their income in rent. There's also more than 500,000 men, women, and children who are homeless every night, wondering where they're going to sleep. 40,000 of them are veterans of our armed forces. And I'm sure everybody here knows those statistics by memory. But you recognize that it's really a tragedy for a nation as prosperous as ours to see anyone forced to sleep on the streets or to sacrifice the necessities of life in order to pay their rent. So you've dedicated your careers, as this foundation has, to helping your fellow Americans. I see this generous spirit on display every day by the dedicated team at HUD. You know, when I came there, many people said, this is going to be a terrible environment because you have a lot of people who have different beliefs, and they're going to be sticks in the mud and they're not going to help you. I didn't find that to be the case at all. I made it a point to talk to the people who've been there for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. They have a lot of knowledge, and a lot of them are very interested in helping solve these problems, which are not partisan problems. They are problems that involve Americans of all stripes. And that's the way we have to start thinking about it. And those people, they know that safe, fair, affordable housing is of fundamental importance to everyone. It's not just a matter of shelter, but a strong foundation for human flourishing, whether in education, health, or economic mobility. That makes the current shortage of affordable rental housing an urgent concern to every community in need, and really to the entire nation. And to address it, it's going to require all hands on deck. Everybody's going to have to get invested in this. Over the decades, we've seen that public dollars and decision-making from Washington has not really solved the problem. It's not that people weren't trying, but our programs have helped many people, but they cannot have a permanent effect on our society or address the full range of human needs without robust support from some of our most important civil units, including our churches and our nonprofits, our charities, our fraternal organizations, our businesses, indeed, our families themselves. And if these parts of our national fabric are not strong, then our efforts will be in vain. If our efforts weaken them, then it means we need to rethink some of our policies. We must engage the genius and the leadership of private enterprise and local authorities. They are most connected to the people we serve and can often be extremely effective. All of their combined resources, expertise, and goodwill are necessary for the success of any endeavor. And if you look back on the history of our nation and the history of innovation, the motivation of people because we created the right atmosphere for that innovation and that hard work to thrive. And that's what led us from nowhere on the world scene to the pinnacle of the world in record time. And if we remember the principles of creating an environment that's conducive to innovation and not one that represses it, I think we will flourish once again. As you know, the low-income housing tax credit has been one of the most effective tools we have to create affordable housing today by harnessing the private resources to build affordable rental housing. And HUD's RAD program, the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program, also allows localities to leverage public and private resources to ensure that public housing units are maintained and improved. Over $4 billion in new private and public funds have been leveraged through the RAD program. You know, when it was conceived, we were very thrilled about the fact that we were leveraging about 4 private dollars to every 1 public dollars. Now we're up to 19 private dollars to every 1 public dollar. And it would have taken public housing authorities 46 years to raise the funds necessary for the capital remediations that have been done already. So those kinds of statistics are the things that should be driving the policies that we make in terms of creating and maintaining the facilities and growing the facilities that we need for affordable housing in this country. We also need to be thinking about what we need to do to develop people so that they don't necessarily need housing assistance. That's something that we don't talk about as much as we should. And as far as I'm concerned, it should be a major priority for our government. But what we have to understand is as we create programs to elevate people, to help them to climb those ladders of opportunity, we must not, as we have in the past, pull the rug out from underneath them as soon as they start climbing the ladder. Because there are other people who are watching, and they say, well, they start climbing the ladder, and you see what happens. And I'm not going to do that. I'll just sit here. So, you know, we have to obviously pay attention to these things when we craft our policies if we want to have the right kind of effect. HUD is committed to putting more Americans on the path to home ownership. It gives a family a chance to build equity. In fact, it's the main way that wealth is generated in our country. The average net worth of a renter, $5,000. Average net worth of a homeowner, over $200,000. That's a 40-fold difference. And that's one of the reasons that, you know, a decade ago there was so much emphasis on getting people into homes. But it has to be done the right way, obviously. To put someone in a home that they can't afford is not really doing them any favors. They lose the home, they lose their credit, they lose their future opportunities. Obviously, we have to learn from all of those things and make sure that we don't repeat those mistakes. But there are things that we can definitely do. Home ownership and renting are complementary elements of our housing system. Unfortunately, high rent burdens are making it very difficult for some first-time home buyers to save for a down payment. We have to help to do this. And one of the things that we're working on right now, instead of some of the more complex family self-sufficiency things that have been done in the past, is doing something that it's very easy for people to understand, and that is taking a small portion of the monthly support that is being given for public housing or rent support, putting that into escrow that's attached to that unit. All the maintenance care of that unit comes out of that escrow. So if there are always holes poked in the screen, and the door always has to be painted because it's scratched up, the toilet always has to be fixed, it's coming out of that escrow. But if that's not happening, it just continues to grow, month over month, year over year. And if a person then leaves assisted housing, within 5 to 10 years, they get all of that money for down payment. And you know, there are a lot of people who work very hard, they struggle just to stay afloat. They would never be able to actually save enough for a down payment. But it also makes them start thinking differently. You know, if the toilet is running, they're a lot more likely to lift the lid off and see if they can fix it than to call somebody to come fix it, which comes out of their escrow account. If little Johnny is taking his pencil and a hammer and poking holes in the wall, they're going to say, Johnny, you stop that. That's not going to work. You know, and they start thinking more like home owners. And also, when you start thinking that way, you start thinking more about what's going to be happening in a year or 5 years or 10 years. You're much more likely to take advantage of educational programs and training programs. And, you know, it's just really a matter of helping to change the mindset and get people prepared for home ownership. Now, recently, we issued some regulations for the FHA to make condo ownership easier for first-time buyers. These new regulations eliminate many of the hurdles that first-time homeowners of condominiums have faced. And you know, condominium ownership is frequently the first step on the home ownership ladder. This is especially important for the millennial generation, whose housing opportunities have suffered from the housing crisis in the past decade, and who in many cases have very substantial educational debts that they have to deal with as well. Now, I know that later today, Chris Campbell from the Treasury Department is going to be discussing regulations affecting primary and secondary markets and talking about Secretary Mnuchin's views on housing finance reform. So I don't want to get too far into the details of that right now, though we have been doing a lot of discussing. But I will say this, there is broad agreement that there is an opportunity to reform and ensure a well-functioning housing finance system for future generations that expands the role of the private sector and reduces taxpayer exposure. And we will approach these questions comprehensively, learning from what's happened in the past to avoid unintended consequences. Our goals for housing are intimately tied to helping the whole human person in health, employment, and education especially. And the private sector has a part to play here as well. But if our efforts end at shelter or a voucher, we've only served families halfway. We must do more. It's not enough just to help them survive. We really have to help them thrive. That's why with the Housing First initiative, we support that. But we also support Housing Second and Housing Third. Housing First means get them off the street, because you leave someone on the street, on average, it costs about $43,000 to $44,000 a year. To house them costs less than $20,000. So just practically speaking, that makes more sense. That's Housing First. But Housing Second is then you diagnose why they're in that condition. And Housing Third, you fix it. And that's the way we have to start thinking about things. That's why we're planning Envision Centers for American cities. They're going to be hubs for educational opportunity, counseling, child care, because so many young women, as you know, pregnant, and that first pregnancy usually ends their formal education. They become dependent on the system. We want them to be able to get their GED, their bachelor's, their associates, their master's, become self-sustaining, but more importantly, teach that to their children. So we begin to break the cycles that have been growing year over year, decade over decade. These are things that we can do if we think about it. There'll also be centers for mentorship. There are a lot of people out there who would be wonderful mentors, but they don't really know what mechanism can be used. And many studies have shown that low opportunity children who are mentored graduate from high school at a much higher rate than those who are not. So we want to take advantage of all of those and more things, and you'll be hearing more about the Envision Centers, but will be opportunities for the private sector to engage with the government in providing the kind of environment that will actually nurture and develop our people. Because isn't that what our success is really about? Developing our most precious resource, which is not our gold or our silver, but which is our people. And those investments can only happen if we unleash our entrepreneurs, make it easier for Americans and their businesses to create jobs and build affordable housing. That's why I hope that any tax reform that we get from Congress strengthens our ability to produce affordable rental housing. And I hope that Congress allows Americans to keep more of their own money. I know the President shares this commitment, and that's why he's directed all the federal agencies to guard against burdening American families and their businesses with unnecessary and expensive regulations. In keeping with the executive order, HUD has established a regulatory reform task force charged with identifying agency regulations that should be repealed, replaced, or modified. We want our partners in affordable housing to be free to innovate, to renew, and to give back to their communities. And what has happened over the past is people put regulations in place, and they're good people and they're well-meaning. And then they come up with an even better one, and they put that one in on top of it rather than replacing it. So we wind up with, a pile of regulations to get from point A to point B. Instead of it being a straight line, it becomes a labyrinth, and it costs a lot of money and a lot of time. And that's something that we are working on very hard to fix. And, there is progress being made. Homelessness. From 15 years ago, we had 800,000 homeless people. Now it's down to 550,000. That's still a lot of people, and we still have a lot of work to do. But, a lot of localities have actually declared an end to homelessness among veterans and even among some non-veterans. And more Americans are finding work with the lowest unemployment rates in 17 years. And this is one of the most important factors towards self-sufficiency, and therefore our mission. And one of the things that we're revamping and pushing is Section 3 that says when you're getting HUD funding, you have to hire the local low-income people. It's been on the book for 49 years. It hasn't been used very much because people say, well, there's a skills gap. These people don't know how to weld, they don't know how to do brickwork or any of these other things. But they do have brains, which means that they can think ahead and know a year or two ahead that the project is coming and start training the people then. And that's one of the ways that we're working on modifying Section 3 so that some of those requirements are there. And I think we'll see a big result then, because then we start giving people real skills which allow them to actually move out of a dependent situation and become part of the fabric of the American dream. The stock market is also setting records. And the reason that that's so important, a lot of people don't invest in the stock market themselves, but their 401ks do, their various retirement programs do. And for the last decade, those things have not performed, and we ended up with a lot of people at retirement age who don't have what they need. And that's one of the reasons that you saw a lot more interest in reverse mortgages. But reverse mortgage program is really more of a senior welfare program. And we had to do some pretty significant modifications of that, which some people say, they screamed and hollered about it. But now they're saying that it really is working. And that's good. And that's helping us to be able to maintain the financial backstop that's necessary with the mortgage insurance fund. All of those are things that we have to be thinking about sort of in a conglomeration. As advocates for affordable housing, our challenge for this next year is to keep this momentum going and to make sure that the benefits are shared by all Americans, including the most vulnerable ones. Our nation's prosperity is only worth bragging about if it includes everybody, including our most vulnerable citizens. And I think together we can expand those opportunities, strengthen affordable housing, pave the road to home ownership. But we can only do it if we're willing to work together. And if we don't succumb to the purveyors of hatred and division, which are all over our society today, disguised in many different ways, but creating divisions based on race, income, religion, age, virtually any demographic that they can come up with. And if you look at the history of mankind and you look at the history of societies, societies that divide themselves do not succeed. A house divided against itself cannot stand. It never has stood. It never will stand. It's people like us in this room who have to make that clear. And think about, one of the things that helped this country to move forward so quickly. Courageous pioneers who fought for those who were coming after them, who thought about what would be better for the next generation, didn't only think about themselves, but who also helped each other. If a farmer was repairing the roof on his shed and he fell off and broke his leg and it was harvest time, people didn't say, he should have had insurance. What's he doing up there anyway? No, they pitched in and they harvested his crops for him. And if they had a problem later on, he helped them. Isn't that the kind of spirit that made America into a great place? Something that I think we need to start thinking about again. And it's something that we can do with compassion, with innovation, with thoughtfulness, because that's who we are. We're Americans, and this is the United States of America. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary. It's my privilege to take a few minutes to ask the Secretary a few questions to further this discussion. Thank you so much for making the effort to be with us today. That was terrific.
A pleasure. I'm sure your first question is, why did I steal Pam?
No, but I'm sure she's back there working hard today. She had a great background and passion for it, so I'm sure you guys will make a great team. So I think we all know you came to HUD with an incredibly distinguished career in medicine. Kind of thinking back about that, how might that have given you good background for leading the nation's top housing agency? And a follow-up kind of is, what was the biggest surprise so far since you got to HUD?
Well, as a pediatric neurosurgeon, I spent a lot of time and effort, sometimes all night long, operating on kids in an attempt to give them a second chance at life. And only to find myself saddened by the fact that in many cases I had to send them back into a terrible environment. And sometimes I would even order extra tests so they could stay in the hospital an extra day. Don't tell anybody. But now, as Secretary of HUD, there's an opportunity to actually do something about those environments, about lead, about mold, about conditions. And I find that to be a wonderful thing. But also, we had to do a lot of complex operations, which required a lot of people from lots of disciplines. And, learning to work with a lot of different people and communicate the goals so that everybody is working in the same direction. That was something that I learned that was extraordinarily useful to me as well. And then, I spent a lot of time on big corporate boards. I was on Kellogg's board for 18 years, Costco for 16 years. Learned a lot about hiring the right kind of people and management of large groups of people and creating goals. And that is actually the most important part of a leadership position, knowing how to create goals and motivate people. When I first took this job, a lot of people said, "But you're a doctor. You can't possibly know anything about housing." Actually, doctors do know about housing. But anyway, I say, it's more like the CEO of a hospital. A CEO of a hospital frequently even isn't not a doctor and doesn't know anything about infectious disease or nuclear medicine studies, but they have a lot of people who do know about those things and can get those people moving in the right direction and create a great medical center.
How about your biggest surprise coming to HUD?
The biggest surprise was the fact that so many of the career people there were willing to step up to the plate. They saw that I didn't have any help, and they saw the politics that were being played, and they said, "We're not going to let this happen. We're not going to let you fail." And they stepped up to the plate, and they're still stepping up to the plate. I think it's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, that must have been really encouraging. So we're here today because those of us in the room think there's a lot of challenges in housing. I know you know firsthand now, having been there for 5 months. What do you think the top 3 challenges in housing are today?
You're right. There's a lot of challenges there. Affordable housing is a big issue. We're able to help about 1 out of 4 families in need of affordable housing. And I'm very thrilled with the emergence of public-private partnerships and people beginning to actually understand how those work. And we have to do everything we can to really facilitate them. The old model was the government rides in on a white horse with a big bucket of money and says, "Build this multifamily dwelling," and then takes off for the next place.
And tell us if you have an overrun.
Right. And that didn't work too well. But with public-private partnerships, there is an investment by the local community in what's going on, and that is maintained. Another, I think, very substantial problem is the fact that a lot of people have not traditionally been motivated to move. So they get into an apartment and they just stay there. And then the backlog keeps producing. So that means what we really need to be concentrating on is how do we move people forward so that we prevent the backlog. Our success is not how many people we get into public housing, but how many we get out of it. And that creates the stream that we need. But more importantly, you look at our population, we only have 330 million people. And China and India both have 4 times that many people. We have to compete with them, which means we need to develop our people. We need to get the biggest bang for the buck for all of our people if we're going to be able to compete into the future with them. And that is absolutely critical.
Yeah, give people a hand up, give them an opportunity.
Absolutely.
That's great. So one of the things that's been stressing the housing advocates out has been tax reform. My foundation actually has pointed towards this for 3 years, hoping that with tax reform we could get more resources committed to affordable housing. The House plan came out, and instead of doing that, it did preserve the low-income housing tax credit. So we were all appreciative of that, but a lot of people didn't know that private activity bonds and the Section 4 credits that come with them create an equal number of units and preserve an equal number of units. What can we do to try to get the message across to Congress that we have a shortage of affordable housing now, and reducing our ability to produce new supply is just going to be catastrophic for this country and affordable housing?
Well, you have a lot of people in this room that represent a lot of different entities, all of which are represented by congressmen and senators. And, they actually do notice when people send them letters. Get your constituents to talk about this. They will take notice. They hear it from me all the time, but you know, it really makes a bigger impression when you hear it from somebody who's going to vote for you or not vote for you. And we just have to bring it to a level of consciousness. But, you know, the thing that we're doing is actually showing them examples of what works. And some of these places that I've visited in recent weeks where these various programs have been used, you know, I was in Atlanta a few weeks ago, for instance, and, you know, a community that used to be just one of the worst places you could imagine, with extremely high crime rates and, you know, excessive poverty, was now transformed into a place that anybody would want to live in. The school, which had been perennially the worst performing public school, is now performing at the 99th percentile, better than a lot of the private schools there. You know, these are the kinds of things that we are capable of doing if we work across silos. But it does mean an investment. And what we have got to get a lot of the people in Washington to understand is that when you invest with the thought of getting an increase or getting something in return. But if we don't invest, we can't really move far beyond where we are. And if we divest, we perhaps go in exactly the opposite direction.
Yeah, very true. And what I hope the message is for everybody in the audience is please let your congressmen and senators hear from you on this really critical issue. Next, I thought, you know, as a doctor, that housing is a social determinant of health. Dr. Meg Sandell, one of our guests here today, called housing a vaccine for health. What's HUD doing to better integrate housing with healthcare supportive services, something that will grow in importance in a rapidly aging population?
Yeah, well, obviously we're paying a tremendous amount of attention to things like lead. You've probably read about a lot of the communities where we've increased the amount of funding for that. Obviously, we're looking at mold. We're making suggestions to people about, in this environment where we've had all these natural disasters, how do we mitigate against them in the future by building things in a safer way, by maybe not putting things like drywall on the first floor or in the basement, using something that's much more resistant. But the other thing is, as communities are developed, creating communities that actually have clinics that are available to the people there. Because so many, particularly poor people, use the emergency room as their primary care. The emergency room costs 5 times more than it would to go to a clinic, plus you don't get appropriate types of follow-up, so you end up with a lot more people with stage 4 diseases. And it really is a significant cost savings, as well as being able to provide for people the kind of health care that they deserve. If we start thinking that way, we end up as a society saving a lot more money rather than squabbling over, you know, a few pennies here and there. We save tons of money when we start thinking that way.
Yeah, clearly a healthier society is a better house society, and vice versa, I think. So that's a great focus. One more question, and then we'll let you get back to Washington. You know, there's a lot that's going on. We've had healthcare debates. We've had debates about infrastructure. There's been a lot of focus on areas other than housing. But housing is a fundamental need, some say a right, foundational for families. Why is it that in Congress, I don't remember the last president that ever talked about housing, why is it that housing doesn't get much in the way of discussion and much less emphasis? What do you think about that?
Well, I think a lot of poor people don't vote.
Right.
And they tend to pay more attention to people who vote than people who don't. Homeowners have a tendency to vote, and therefore, when you look at the way that the dollars are spent, you know, on housing, about $200 billion a year, 70% of that is directed toward
Homeownership.
homeownership.
Yep.
And it's strictly a matter of politics and what works. But, you know, we have to move beyond that and have to begin to have that vision of how do we perpetuate a strong society and how do we make that society even stronger. We're not going to do that if we have an increasing number of people becoming dependent, not being developed. So, you know, when we begin to think that way, I think maybe some of that attention will begin to shift.
You're very generous with your time. Thank you so much for being with us. Nice seeing you again.